December the 31st was a pretty significant day, December the 31st, 2020. It was the final day in a year that many of us will be very glad to see the back of. It was our final day in the European Union, which, whatever your emotions about that fact, and they'll probably have been very varied, that was significant in the life of our nation. You may have read the Star of Bethlehem was apparently knocking around as well, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. I think the wise men must have had rather less clouds than we did, since they were able to follow it. But however you look at it, it certainly feels like we are living through some pretty momentous days right now, as though there are seismic shifts going on in the world around us, and even signs in the heavens above. And that may help us to capture something of the wonder of the Epiphany. Because the appearance of the Magi at Bethlehem that we heard in our gospel reading, there, that was the foretaste of a tectonic movement in the history of the world. The Epiphany, the revelation, was the moment when Jesus was first seen as someone who was not just for the Jews, but who was for the whole world. And I find it an absolutely fascinating story and an illustration of the way in which God works and the response which he calls for from us. It's a story which begins among the lives of the Magi, so we're not told very much about them, but what we can gather is that they must have been practicing their philosophy, their religion, astrology, seeking signs among the stars. And the story does not begin with God wrenching them out of those practices, but rather he uses what they have. He meets them where they are, and he leads them, he points them to something, to someone greater. Why do they go looking for the King of the Jews? They're not Jews. Why do they travel looking for a new king for a nation that is really of no concern of theirs? And why do they, when they find this king of a different small nation, why do they give him gifts and pay him homage? He's not their king. But he has his own star. That's why they search. That's why they pay homage, because in their religion, anyone who has their own star is unprecedented, is of immense significance in the whole world order, and homage is due to such a person from all nations, from all people. So the story begins in a language that the Magi understand, the language of astrology. But that language is then challenged as well, because firstly they go to Jerusalem, to the capital city of the Jews. Where else would a king be born? But it turns out not here. They're pointed instead towards Bethlehem. And eventually they find the baby Jesus, probably not in a stable anymore, but certainly not in a palace. This is not what they're expecting. And yet no murmurs are recorded. They don't debate among themselves, as far as we can see, whether or not this is the king, but instead they offer to him the lavish gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh. They kneel down and they pay him homage. They worship him. And this is a picture of that shift that Jesus brings. See, Jesus wasn't just for the Jews. Jesus calls all kinds of people, of every nation, of every colour, religion, creed, to come, whoever they are, from wherever they are, to come just as they are. But he doesn't call anyone, he doesn't call us to simply stay as we are. He calls us to recognize in him someone greater than whatever or whoever we come to him with. And the wise men, the Magi, in their wisdom, demonstrate for us the correct response as we too are confronted by Jesus. It is to kneel before him, to adore him, to worship him. Christianity doesn't try and pretend that truth and wisdom cannot be found elsewhere. The Epiphany is proof of this at the very birth of Jesus. God meets each person where they're at. He uses the wisdom that they have found. God is committed, if you like, to our very modern buzzwords of diversity and inclusion. Just have a look at the reading from Paul in Ephesians. There we see the Gentiles have become fellow heirs, members of the same body and sharers in the promise of Christ Jesus through the gospel. Through the church, the wisdom of God in its rich variety, its diversity, might now be made known. But all diversity and inclusion is exclusive at some point. You cannot, for example, have an inclusive community which includes people with very exclusive views because they stop the community feeling inclusive. Therefore, they must be excluded. You cannot have a group in which everyone is very similar if you wish to be diverse. Therefore, uniform groups must be excluded from anything with a strong commitment to diversity. And so, Christ is inclusive and recognises diversity. All are welcome, just as they are, with whatever they bring. But no one must imagine that when they come to Christ, they will not change. We must not imagine that as we come to Christ, as we follow Christ, we will not be called to change. Not that as Christians we should all become clones of each other. Diversity is genuinely celebrated. The rich expressions of culture and personality and thought that we bring, they are celebrated. But the change that God calls forth in you and me, above all else, can be found in that picture offered by the wise men. Here is one they recognize, whose significance is greater than anything or anyone else we have ever encountered. The incarnation is not diverse. God is not inclusive when it comes to other claims of divinity. There is one faith, one Lord, one baptism. God was incarnate only in one man, Jesus Christ. There is one person who can call the dead forth from the grave, one who can calm storms, heal the sick, cast out demons. There is one who was raised from the dead. And so the response of the Magi is to be our response also, to offer him what we have in our hands, to kneel before him and to worship. These are the words of the last verse of that carol in the bleak midwinter. What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would give a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. But what I give him, I give him my heart. Now, I love this carol, and we'll listen to it in a moment. We'll sing it together. But I do think that poetry has won out over meaning in the final verse there. Actually, what the verse really wants to say is that the wise men are a great model for us. They give of what they have to the Christ child. But more importantly, they recognize him for the matchless King he is. They kneel before him and they worship him. So, with apologies to Christina Rossetti, who wrote the words for In the Bleak Midwinter, I thought I'd give us this alternative final verse for the carol, just to help us to remember this Epiphany, the response that the Christ child calls forth from the world, calls forth from us, that we see in the Magi from the East. And I'm afraid I've sacrificed rhyme for meaning. But I've included it there on your service sheet. What can I give him, poor as I am? Like the Eastern Magi, I'll give from what I have. I'll kneel before the manger to worship and adore. For this little baby is Christ the Lord. So we're going to sing that song in a moment, and do please feel free to use my amended lyrics that I've included in our song sheet there. But one of the things that this carol really does for me, leaving aside the slightly shaky lyrics of the last verse. One of the things this carol really does is it lets us glimpse, there's something about the music, it lets us glimpse the wonder of the Christmas story. And so at the tumultuous turn of this new year, at this Epiphany, let's remember that the one who makes sense of every twist and turn of history is the one who was revealed to the world as the wise men knelt to worship Christ, the Lord of all the earth. And let's begin our own journey into 2021 on our knees before him.